Konnichiwa. My name is Dr. Alex Rosen. I am a pediatrician from Germany and a member of the board of German IPPNW, the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War. I was asked to speak to you today about the IPPNW critique on the Unscary Report. As you may know, the United Nations Scientific Committee on the Effects of Atomic Radiation, Unscare, published its report on the health effects of the Fukushima nuclear catastrophe in April of 2014. In its report, the Commission comes to the conclusion that no discernible health effects are to be expected as a result of the release of radioactivity in Fukushima. As doctors and scientists that are concerned with the health of our patients, we see this report as a systematic underestimation of the health effects that are to be expected in the affected population. Going through the report, we have identified 10 critical issues that I will now in detail discuss with you. The first issue that we found critical is the validity of the so-called source term. Now, the source term represents the amount of radioactive material actually released during the nuclear catastrophe. On the left-hand side, you can see a photo of the plume carrying radioactive isotopes from the nuclear plant into the atmosphere. Isotopes like iodine-131 or cesium-137. And on the right-hand side, you can see the trajectory of some of the radioactive fallout over mainland Japan. Now, we know that the Japanese population was relatively lucky because almost 80% of radioactive fallout actually occurred over the Pacific Ocean rather than over landmass. However, there was still substantial amounts of radioactive material deposited over Honshu Island. And in order to calculate or estimate the expected health effects, you first need to know how much radioactive material actually was released. Now, several institutions have dealt with this question. One being the Independent Research Institute in Norway, NILU, an institute dealing with air research and geology, and another being TEPCO and the Japanese Atomic Energy Agency, an organization that is very close to the Japanese nuclear industry and which has actually been criticized by the Japanese parliament for collusion and corruption after the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear catastrophe. Now, what Unscare did in its report is it based its entire body of conclusions not on the findings of the independent research institutes in Austria or Norway, but solely on the numbers published by the Japanese Atomic Energy Agency. And we can see here in this graph that while NILU, the independent Norwegian institute, estimated the amount of radioactive cesium-137 to be 37 petabecquerel, JAEA published numbers that are more than 4 times lower. And the same is true for radioactive iodine, where again JAEA published numbers that are by factors lower than the numbers even published by TEPCO. And this, in our view, represents a systematic underestimation not only of the source term, but obviously also of the expected health effects. The second issue is that of the ingestion of radioactive material through food and water. Similar to the estimation of the source term, in order to adequately calculate the expected health effects, you first need to know how much radioactivity was actually taken up by people through food and water. And in order to do that, you need a good database that shows you how much radioactivity certain types of food actually contained at certain points of time. Now, what Unscare does is it bases its entire conclusions on one single source of information. And this is the food database compiled by the International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA. And again, the IAEA cannot be considered a neutral source of information because in its founding document, the IAEA states that its purpose is to promote nuclear energy all over the world. On this graph, for example, you can see that the data published in the IAEA and WHO report coming from the the IAEA food database, is substantially lower than the estimates, for example, by the Japanese Ministry for Science and Technology, MEXT. Almost 5 times lower. These are maximum radioactivity readings in leafy vegetables in Fukushima prefecture. The third issue is that of the health effects of the workers on site at the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant. You can see in these pictures the working conditions of the more than 24,000 people coming into contact with radioactivity on a daily basis. Now, more than 70% of these workers are actually not directly employed by TEPCO and do not fall under TEPCO's relatively strict radiation regulations, but are employed by subcontractors or sub-subcontractors. And in many cases we have heard reports about dosimeters covered up by lead in order to falsely measure lower amounts of radioactive exposure. We have heard reports about subcontractors not issuing health reports, not letting their workers go to regular health checks. So the fact that Unscare bases its entire body of conclusions regarding the health effects on workers on the data supplied by TEPCO itself is of great concern to us as scientists and doctors, many of us occupational physicians, who know that in order to adequately assess the health of the workers, you cannot rely on the company that actually put these workers in danger because of its short-sighted policies. And the company we're talking about, TEPCO, has actually been criticized severely by the Japanese Parliament's Investigation Commission for being mainly responsible in causing this nuclear catastrophe. The fourth issue is the effects of radioactivity on the non-human biota, meaning animals and plants. Now this is important not only from an environmentalist point of view, to look at the severe damage that the nuclear catastrophe has caused on the environment, but also from a scientific physician's point of view. Because if we better understand the effects of radioactivity on living beings, on animals, on mammals especially, we come to a better understanding of the effects of radioactivity on humans. Now, Unscare basically negates any effects of radioactivity on the non-human biota by stating that everything has been said in their reports from 1998 and 2008, acting as if no new scientific evidence has come out since then. Just very recently, 2 studies have come out dealing with the amount of, or the animal population size in Fukushima, comparing it to the animal population size in Chernobyl. And you can see that similar effects are seen in butterflies or birds, namely that there is a decrease in population size in the affected regions. Most probably coming from increased amounts of radioactivity. And the second study I briefly want to touch upon is one performed on monkeys in near Fukushima city that show increased levels of cesium-137 in their muscle biopsies. They were compared to a group of monkeys living in the north of Japan under similar conditions, which had lower levels of cesium, or no measurable levels of cesium in their muscles because they were not affected by radioactive fallout. And you can see that the monkeys living in the forests around Fukushima city have discernibly lower levels of blood cells, mainly red and white blood cells, than the comparison group in northern Japan. And these studies are very important to us as physicians because they help us understand the effects of radioactivity on human beings or on living beings, especially on mammals, and we can draw conclusions for human health, from these studies. So we're greatly concerned that Unscary completely leaves out all of these studies and all of these findings in its report. The fifth critical issue in the Unscary report is the vulnerability of the unborn child, especially the embryo. Now, we know for many decades already that the unborn child has an increased sensitivity or vulnerability to ionizing radiation. Even in the 1950s, Alice Stewart found that a single X-ray to a pregnant woman's womb would double the risk for childhood leukemia in her child. Now, Unscary goes to great lengths in its Annex B to discuss the increased level of sensitivity of children as opposed to adults to radioactivity, showing that children who are exposed to the same level of radioactivity display higher percentage of leukemia, thyroid cancer, brain cancer, breast cancer, and neurologic or psychological effects. What Unscary completely ignores and negates is the fact that the unborn child has an even higher sensitivity to ionizing radiation. This is due to the high metabolism, the high turnover of cells in the embryo, which is developing, and this of course leads to a higher risk for mutations in the genome, in the chromosomes. The immune system and the cell repair mechanisms are not yet fully developed in the unborn child, so they cannot adequately protect the child from cancer that is developing. On the picture on the left-hand side, you can see a simple graphic that illustrates how radioactive particles can travel through the woman's blood supply into the womb and hence into the child. For example, iodine-131, ingested or inhaled by the mother, actually accumulates in the fetal thyroid gland and can lead to the development of thyroid disease or thyroid cancer after birth. And cesium-137 freely passes through the blood supply into the placenta, into the embryo, accumulates in the amniotic fluid, in the bladder, and affects the unborn from all sides with beta and gamma radiation. In dismissing all of these physiological differences between the unborn child and the infant, the authors of the Unscary report effectively underestimate the health risks of this particularly vulnerable population. In fact, studies on the hibakusha of Hiroshima and Nagasaki actually show that the non-cancer health effects, namely through cardiovascular disease, stroke and heart attacks, are just as high as the health effects through cancer diseases. We know that ionizing radiation, even at very low levels, causes measurable damage to the cell's genome, to the chromosomes, to the DNA. And you can see on the right-hand side a graphic of how radioactive isotopes damage the DNA. And we know that damage to the DNA can lead to mutations and to cancer, but also has numerous other effects on the metabolic system, on the cardiovascular system, can have effects, if we're talking about the reproductive cells, on virility, on perinatal mortality. There are numerous studies that show cognitive effects, increased rates of spontaneous abortion, of miscarriages, of perinatal mortality, of cardiovascular disease in people who were exposed to increased levels of low-level ionizing radiation. Still, Unscary states in its report that it expects to see none of these. And because they did not expect to see any of them, they did not look into them. The seventh contentious issue in the Unscary report is the misleading comparison to background radiation. Unscary states in several parts of its report that the expected amount of ionizing radiation that the population is confronted with compares to or is below levels of naturally occurring background radiation. Now, this leads the reader to conclude that it is not dangerous, because if it's lower than natural background radiation, it cannot be harmful. But this is a misunderstanding, because in fact we know that there is a linear relationship between the level of ionizing radiation that an organ or a tissue is exposed to and the risk of developing cancer and other diseases. And this relation, this dose-response relation, goes down to even the very lowest levels of ionizing radiation. There is no threshold below which we can say that radiation is harmless. That also means that background radiation, represented here in this picture by cosmic radiation, terrestrial radiation, natural radiation in food, natural radiation from radon gas coming out of the ground, are all known causes of increased levels of cancer. And on the right-hand side, you can see a study from the United Kingdom that shows different levels of natural background radiation leading to increased levels of childhood leukemia. This study came to the conclusion that a number of cases of childhood leukemia are actually caused by natural background radiation. And this is the case for all types of cancer. The level of natural background radiation in Japan is approximately 1.5 millisieverts per year. Now this is about the same as 75 chest x-rays. And you would hardly find a doctor that would do 75 chest x-rays on a child by stating that this would only represent the amount of natural radiation that a child is exposed to within a year anyways, so no harm is to be expected. This is simply not how ionizing radiation works. You need to decrease the dose of every individual as low as possible. Against natural background radiation, we can do relatively little, but we must prevent additional sources of ionizing radiation. Our eighth point of criticism is Unscary's interpretation of the findings that it presents in the report. In its press release, Unscary comes to the conclusion that, quote, no discernible changes in future cancer rates and hereditary diseases are expected due to exposure to radiation as a result of the Fukushima nuclear accident, and that no increases in the rates of birth defects are expected. It is important to realize that this statement is not saying that there will be no health effects, but only that these health effects will most likely not be detected by commonly used epidemiological methods. And this is an old trick that we've known for many decades from the tobacco industry, the automotive industry, the asbestos industry, who all argue against a causal link between their product, cigarette smoke or asbestos or exhaust fumes, and lung disease. No cancer carries a label of origin. It is impossible to determine the exact cause of one single cancer. But if you look at epidemiological research on a certain population, you will be able to find evidence that an increase in unhealthy living standard, for example, the amount of cigarette smoke or the amount of ionizing radiation that you're exposed to, shows an increased level of cancer risk. Another important fact is that when you compare the 292-page full report to the 22-page summary or the one-page press release, miraculously, the level of certainty that is represented in these documents seems to increase the smaller the document gets. In its report, Unscary actually admits that there was incomplete knowledge about the release rates of radionuclides over time and the weather conditions during the releases, and that there were insufficient measurements of gamma dose rates and of radionuclides in the air during the passage of the radioactive plumes for an assessment to be made of the external exposure based on environmental measurements. Also, the author states that relatively few measurements of foodstuff were made in the first months, and that there was insufficient information on the transfer of radionuclides to food. All of these uncertainties, however, are in no way represented in the summary or the press release. The next critical issue is the misrepresentation of the actual protective measures taken by the authorities. In its report and its press releases, Unscare applauds the protective measures taken by the authorities. The Japanese Parliament's Investigation Commission, however, finds that the central government was slow in informing the municipal governments about the nuclear power plant accident and failed to convey the severity of the accident. The Commission concludes that the situation in Fukushima deteriorated because the crisis management system of the Kantai, the regulators, and other responsible agencies did not function correctly. The damning criticism of the Parliament's Investigation Commission goes on to state that the government and the regulators were not fully committed to protecting public health and safety and have not acted to protect the health of the residents and to restore their welfare. One example is the lack of distribution of stable iodine tablets after the nuclear meltdown. According to Unscare, medical countermeasures included the use of stable iodine for thyroid blocking. But only careful readers of the report will notice that this stable iodine was only given to 2,000 emergency workers, not to the general public. In fact, the Japanese Parliament's Investigation Commission concluded that although the positive effects of stable iodine were fully known, the government's nuclear emergency response headquarters and the prefectural government failed to give proper instructions to the public. And this error caused thousands of children to become irradiated with iodine-131. Unlike the members of Unscare, we are disturbed by the evidence that the authorities have not made public health and safety their top priority. Instead of adequately protecting the people affected by the radioactive fallout, the annual exposure limits were raised to 20 millisieverts on April 19, 2011, effectively forcing many children to live in radioactively contaminated areas. Our 10th and final point of criticism of the Unscary Report is the lack of meaningful conclusions for the affected population. Unscare does go as far as to cite the expected or estimated amount of radiation for the entire Japanese population due to the nuclear catastrophe, but falls short of translating these numbers in Sievert and Gray into something that people actually can understand. On the left-hand side of this graph, you can see the radiation estimates of the Unscary Report, the total collective dose, and you can see in the middle column the risk factors derived from the internationally acknowledged ROSEN report. And with these two factors, you can actually calculate the number of cancer cases that you expect in a given population over a given time. And using the numbers of the Unscary Report, which again we expect to be systematic underestimates of the true extent of the health effects, we still come to a number of between 4,000 and 16,000 additional cases of cancer. Unscare calls these no discernible increase in cancer rate, but we see 4,000 to 16,000 families bereaved by cancer that they would not have acquired without the nuclear catastrophe. And in the line below that, you can see the mortality rate. And using the mortality risk factor from the ROSEN report, you come to a number of between 2,500 to 9,000 people who actually die as a cause of their cancer. Unscare also calculated the collective thyroid dose of the entire Japanese population, and you can see in the bottom part of the table that using the Unscare numbers, we come to about 1,000 additional cases of thyroid cancer in the Japanese population in the coming decades. And again, this number is by no means trivial if you consider that each one of these will have to have their thyroid removed surgically, will have to take medication for the rest of their lives, will have relapses, and 7% will actually die from thyroid cancer. I hope that by going through these 10 critical issues, you were able to see where the fault lines of this Unscary report lie and why we have so severely criticized this report. We do not see it as a valid basis for drafting policy, for advising policymakers on how to react to nuclear catastrophes in the future or how to prevent them. We do not see that the Unscary Report in any way helps the people living in the affected regions. These people do not need a report whitewashing the crimes of the nuclear industry. What the people of Fukushima rather need is proper information, health monitoring, support, and most of all, what they need is the acknowledgement of their right to a standard of living, which is adequate for their health and their well-being. And this is a universal human right. And what we see is that a lot of people in the regions affected by nuclear fallout are currently denied this very right. But this right to a standard of living adequate for their health and their well-being should be the guiding principle in evaluating the health effects of the nuclear catastrophe, not the industrial interests and not political gains. I thank you for your attention, and I look forward to your questions and comments later on in our video conversation. Arigatou gozaimasu.